Okay. Been having some issues recently where OBS is crashing when I have too many things going on at the same time, but I think it's fine right now. All right. Okay, just loading this up. All right, so we're talking about indie games. So indie games, it's kind of a kind of vague term. It sort of basically describes games that are made outside of big studios or big companies. So independent game makers. So typically, this could really mean a lot of different things. Like sometimes it just is talking about an aesthetic, like the indie game aesthetic. But sometimes it's talking more about the commercial components of the game, like if it's distributed on something like itch.io or another sort of free platform to use. If it's distributed on the internet, if it's distributed for free, things like that. If it's made by a single person, so there's no real one thing that makes an indie game, but there's a few different components that they tend to have in common. So we'll look a little bit at the history. So indie games have existed since the beginning of video game making in various forms. For example, Rogue, which we talked about last week when we were talking about game genres, has a lot of the characteristics of the indie game. Even though it was made in the early 80s, it was distributed without like a big publishing company. It was distributed sort of like word of mouth, just among enthusiasts and hobbyists and friends, probably. And it has a lot of the characteristics that you would expect from an indie game. It has very simple graphics. It has more of a focus on sort of innovative gameplay, and it's as we discussed, it became a sort of blueprint or inspiration for a lot of similar types of games. More recently, like it's kind of a long period of time now. It's probably like the last 10 years for sure, arguably for many years before that as well. The tools of creating games have become much more widely available, and so the indie game world has grown very, very quickly. So it's much easier for individual people or small groups of people who don't necessarily know how to program or build hardware, people who are not necessarily professional artists or sound designers or musicians or all the other different components of games can still use these tools and create games either for fun or for commercial distribution. But that world has really grown. Like the number of games that are being made and the different varieties of games that are being made has really increased a lot over the last 10 to 15 years. So going back a little bit in time, we're going to look at some different indie games, starting with ZZT in 1991, which is a really interesting game in part because it was one of the first games that had a level maker functionality. So a lot of games these days, you'll download the game and play the game, but then part of what's also fun about it is it may have some built-in tools where you can create your own levels. So you can spend a lot of time still working with the material of the game, but creating your own version of it. And then you can share those levels, other people can play those levels, and that may generate, a whole sort of extra, more life of that game beyond.
Hello.
Hi, sorry, can you hear or?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Oh, okay. I'm not sure. Nancy was saying something, but keep going. Nancy, let me know if you have a question or something. All right. So yeah, so ZZT has a level creation functionality. So users could create their own levels and distribute them and play them and give feedback. And that created this whole kind of community around the game outside of the developers of the game. So we can watch a little bit of this just to get a feel for it. And you guys can also tell me if you can hear the audio of the video. I'm not actually sure that this video has audio, but we'll see.
No, I can't hear anything, but
Oh wait, no, just heard something there.
Okay, cool. All right, that's good to know. I think usually the audio comes through the stream, but sometimes it doesn't. So yeah, we can see the ZZT interface is like really, really simple. Even for 1991, there's plenty of games. There weren't a lot of 3D games at this point, but there's plenty of games with more sophisticated graphics. But the focus of ZZT is more on the storytelling, the gameplay, the level creation, and other components. So having really simple graphics makes it easier to distribute the game, to have people be able to create their own levels without necessarily being programmers or art experts. And then we see a lot of the same. It looks a lot like Rogue, which we looked at last week, and other early kind of dungeon crawlers or like adventure style games. So let's see, let's go back. Let's fast forward a little bit. So we can see different levels. And even though the graphics are really simple, we can see there's a lot that can be done with them. So we can continue. So this is much later. So ZZT at this point and before this, there weren't really any game development software like Godot or Unity or things like that. The first one of these was really Game Maker, which was released in 1999. And this video shows 100 Game Maker games in 10 minutes. So it's just an example of a lot of different Game Maker games. And this is really the first kind of software that people could download who weren't programmers, didn't work in a professional studio, but they could build a game using the interface. So it's kind of like, we have Photoshop for images and things like Blender, Cinema 4D for 3D assets and stuff like that. And so Game Maker was the first like interface where you could create your own games. And so this led to a big increase in games being created by individuals and small groups in the early 2000s. And you can see there's a lot of different styles of games here. So, it's not like in ZZT where you're just creating a level that has the sort of aesthetics and behavior already built in. You can add your own graphics and program your own functionality into Game Maker. And you can see there's a huge amount of variety in these games. So one of the cool things about the indie game world is that you can make whatever you want. You don't have to really worry about whether it's going to be a popular game, if it's going to make lots of money and things like that. You can just make something that you're inspired to make. So this obviously goes on for a while, but these are some good examples, and we can keep going. So Cave Story was made in Game Maker, and it's an RPG. It was one of the first really popular games that came out of Game Maker. So we'll watch just a little bit of the beginning. So we can see it has, the basic sort of conventions of a shooter platformer, and it has RPG conventions as well. I forget. I'm just gonna Google this and take a look at the Wikipedia to remember. Let's see. Perception. Let's see. So it had a lot of really good reviews. It was, compared to all these other like big studio games, it's estimated to have sold 590,000 copies on Steam. So it had the impact of a major studio game, but it was created by one developer. So continuing on, So this video touches on a kind of sensitive topic, but there's no really graphic violence in it. Just to give you guys a little bit of a warning. This was made in another software called RPG Maker, which is similar to Game Maker, but specifically for making RPGs. And I think this game is kind of interesting to talk about given the history of indie games. You can see that the video for this is actually restricted on YouTube. And it's got an age kind of barrier on it.
Really that bad?
No, it's just the topic. So
Okay, yeah, I see that.
yeah,
Just popped it up.
yeah. So this is the web page for it, and so the game is based on a mass shooting that happened in 1999 called at Columbine High School, and the game is called Super Columbine Massacre RPG. So it's kind of doing like a satire of this, very tragic event. And part of the reason the game was made is it's a commentary on. You guys were probably like either very young or not born when Columbine happened, so it may not have had as big of a impact. But it was a pretty big event in my life. I was like 14 or 15 when that happened, and it changed a lot of things. And obviously, the game is sort of a satirical look at it, and it was very controversial when it was first released. And part of the sort of commentary about Columbine at the time was there was this kind of moral panic about video games because the two high school students who were responsible for the shooting happened to, play video games like Doom and I forget. I think Doom was maybe the main one.
Also, that's like where that argument of video games cause violence came from. That was from something else, though.
That has been around. I'm going to talk about that in more depth a bit later in the semester in another lecture that talks specifically about depictions of violence in video games. But yeah, this was one of the kind of. Oh yeah, sorry, Richard. Did you have a?
Oh yeah, I spent like $400 on the nicest trench coat that week, and I couldn't wear it right after it. But that's just me being selfish. Anyway,
Yeah.
go on.
That makes sense. So they were that was part of the the look of these guys is that they had these trench coats. What?
Oh my! There's something in my background. Someone's talking in my background there.
Oh, okay, no worries.
I couldn't wear it afterwards, but
Yeah, that makes sense. It became very stigmatized. But yeah, so after this event, there was a lot of like news and other, there's sort of a moral panic around the video games that is basically blaming the violence in video games for the shooting that took place. And as I mentioned, this is something we'll talk about in more depth in a future lesson. But the video game itself is kind of goofy. It puts you in the position of the shooters. I won't show a ton of this, but we can watch just a little bit of this at the beginning so you can get a sense of the aesthetic and what it looks like.
Video games be made illegal. You can email us your opinion at sendit.
2005? Oh, I've never really seen this around.
Yeah, so I don't know. It's not a super popular game, but it made kind of a big splash when it came out. It was sort of controversial.
Many kids spend a lot of time on their computers nowadays playing video games. Super Columbine Massacre is one of the games they're playing. 90,000 free copies of it were downloaded off the internet just last week.
And a new trend in video games. These are games produced to disturb.
So yeah, I think that's enough to give you a sense of, what's happening in the game. And it is kind of disturbing. It's interesting because if you play a game and it's called, you're playing as the police and you're attacking bad guys or something like that, like nobody would really think twice about it. But just by changing the art and putting a different context on it and saying that you're a high schooler who's shooting other high schoolers, that really changes the feeling of the game. And we'll talk about this again a bit more in a later lecture. But this is, this is something that's always been a part of the history of video games, is this idea that they create violence. And there's a lot of studies that have been done that have basically shown that that's not the case. But as far as like thinking about indie games, it's interesting to think about this in the sense that, this game would never have been made by a major studio. And so in a way, having these tools, it allows us to make games as individuals that take on topics that would never be made by a major game studio, because, this wouldn't be probably a popular game. Although, maybe it would be, who knows? But that's something that the indie game world kind of changes, is that anybody can make a game. They can make a game to make any kind of commentary that they want. And, these kind of controversial topics can become the subject of a video game. And of course, video game also has, a video game has this sort of heightened potential of putting somebody in the position of, a bad person, a high school shooter. So that adds to, we're not just like watching a film about it, but we're actually creating agency for the user. So it kind of adds a little bit of a level to that depiction. So keep going. So this is one of the earlier indie games that uses 3D graphics. It's a very weird game called Darwinia, where you kind of simulate evolution, and it's a sort of strategy style game. It's very difficult. It's been a while since I actually played it. I don't know if you could even play. I'm sure you could find an emulator for it if you wanted to, but it's a pretty old game. But it's kind of cool because it has this really goofy aesthetic. Like, again, you wouldn't get something like this from a major game studio. It's just like too weird. But there's stuff about it that I really like, that I really enjoy. And, it kind of represents this sort of particular idiosyncratic vision of a single developer. And this one being 3D would have been a lot harder to make in 2005. These days with Godot or Unity, it would be much easier to make a game like this than it would have at the time that this was made. So keep going. So this game, Saibon Action, I think is really interesting in terms of video games in general, but also in terms of indie games. This is actually one of the research assignments. So if we look at the skill tree and go into research, you can see that Saibon Action, just playing this game, you could, record yourself playing it and do that as your research post. So I don't want to ruin it, but I'll just play a little bit of it. So you can see this says perfect run, which is maybe not the best video to show for this because it's a really weird, frustrating game. You can play it here if you want to try it out. Flash player is no longer supported. I think I have an extension that will fix that. Where is it? So this is an old Flash. There's newer versions of this game that don't require Flash, but there's also a plugin that will let me play Flash. So I'll try this again. There we go. Run in. Okay, it looks like maybe it's not going to work. But I think the link that I have here should work. Yeah. Okay, so this is a port of it. So you can play it here. It's sort of a joke game about Mario where there's a lot of like unexpected weird things that are happening in the game mechanics, and it's really, really annoying and frustrating to play. But some people really enjoy it. So I recommend checking that out. And it's another thing where it's like, it's a really weird and basically really annoying game. So it's never going to be made by a major studio, but it was made by this developer. It became really popular just because it is so idiosyncratic and kind of goofy. So if you're interested in that, I recommend checking it out. It's pretty funny. So another thing with indie games, this is a developer called named Jason Rohrer, and he makes games that are kind of like art games, I think is how he would describe them. Let me see if I have a link to his page. Yeah, so this is his page. And you can see, he's got this indie aesthetic, like very simplified website. These are all the video games that he's made. And he kind of makes these games that have like more poetic or aesthetic goals rather than necessarily like points or, defeating an enemy or something like that. And this game is really very, it's kind of an interesting, the aesthetics of the game are very simplified. It's a really small window essentially. And the story of the game is basically about just a couple walking, across the screen, and you see their life progress as they walk through the screen. So it's very, very simple gameplay. You can't really do anything. You're just kind of pressing forward, up or down, and you see your life in the future as this kind of like vague, distorted image. And as you walk towards it, it becomes more clear. It's still very abstracted, but there's these different abstract shapes that kind of give a sense of your life progressing. And so it's not very challenging, and it's a very short experience, but it's very, aesthetically interesting, and it's very pretty. It has pretty music, and it's sort of about this relationship. So it's a cool example of using game mechanics and game aesthetics and game technology to create something that's more similar to like a work of art, or maybe a short story or a short film or something like that. Another game from around this time period that's for like a console, the PlayStation, is more of an aesthetic experience. So this comes from another indie game studio that has become more popular since they released this game. But this game is basically, it has sprites and interactions and all the things we're used to in a game. But it doesn't necessarily have like a specific goal. So there's just kind of this aesthetic experience that you are controlling with sound and obviously the visuals. There's these sort of like little creatures that are targets, but there's no points, there's no levels. The environment kind of changes as you play. And so this is using more higher level graphics and stuff like that, but it's still kind of a unique, interesting experience. So let's continue. So then Dear Esther from 2008 is a very narrative-based indie game.
Dear Esther, the gulls do not land here anymore. I've noticed that this year they seem to shun the place. Maybe it's the depletion of the fishing stock driving them away. Perhaps it's me. When he first landed here, Donnelly wrote that the herds were sickly and their shepherds the lowest of the miserable classes that populate these Hebridean islands. 300 years later, even they have departed.
So you can get the sense from this game that, it's really focused on the storytelling, the narrative voice, and then these kind of pretty environmental visuals. I think it's a kind of an interesting game to talk about just because it is one of the main games that's responsible for this idea of the walking simulator, which is sort of a goofy term for games that don't have any point, that are, just movies that you have to walk through. I like this video as kind of an example of, people who don't see this as a real game.
I'm here to ask and answer one simple question. WTF is Dear Esther, and I'm doing this because people asked me so much, more so than any game in ages, which is interesting because it isn't a game. So I've finished it. This is probably one of the first times I've ever done. In fact, it may very well be the first time I've ever done a WTF is of a game that I've actually finished. So first impressions barely counts when your game is an hour long.
So I'll just show a little bit of that, but I think it's funny. It's sort of a lot of indie games sort of bring up this blurred line between interactive games and other types of media. And so his main point is that it's not a game. It doesn't have goals. It doesn't have game mechanics. You're just like walking through this film, basically. And so it kind of brings up this interesting question of what makes a game a game. Does it have to have a goal? Does it have to have things like obstacles and rewards? Or is it just the aesthetics of a game engine and the interaction of moving the character around? Is that enough to say that it's a game? A similar style game from Tale of Tales that actually has the site notgames.org. And so they make these kind of visual experiences. I like this one because your avatar is an old woman and you can't move faster or slower. It's just a slow pace and you can only just move forward. And it's pretty, you can see it's a long walk to this bench, and then there's some narration at the end. So I think it's a kind of, it's an interesting commentary on games. It's also kind of a nice visual experience at the same time. You can take a look at their site, although it looks like maybe it doesn't exist anymore. Let's see, maybe their Twitter. What's this frog? Looks like their site is down. Let's see if we can see an archived version of it. All right, let's look back. 2012 seems reasonable. Let's see a version from 2012. Coming releases. Okay, it looks like this isn't very... let's just look at Tale of Tales, because I think they probably still have website. Here we go. So yeah, you can see some different examples of the games that they've created. And let's see. So yeah, they have this kind of goal of creating games that are these beautiful visual experiences. Another indie game from 2008 that has some more familiar game mechanics, but it's kind of an interesting approach to physics. So I like this game trailer. I think it has a cool sort of contrast of the sound and the aesthetics of the game. And you can see a little bit of the game mechanics. It's kind of exploring this unique physics environment.
I played that one. It's really creative and interesting. Highly recommend.
Yeah.
Seriously.
Cool. Yeah, it's a lot of fun. Another game from 2008 that was a very influential indie game is Braid. And this game has a lot of the same sort of mechanics as a regular platformer, but then it kind of plays with those mechanics, and it even sort of wraps the way it plays with mechanics into the narrative of the game. So it has a pretty typical narrative where you're playing as a character who's trying to save a princess, but it kind of inverts that narrative as you play the game. And it also plays with time, so you have a little bit of control over time in the game. So it's kind of interesting adding in this other sort of physical dimension of games, which is the time component. So let's watch a little bit of this. I think I might, let's see what this part is. I might skip forward a little bit. And you can see it has a bit of a different aesthetic than what you might expect from games. Like it has this kind of acoustic music and sort of detailed, almost like watercolor style paintings. I'm gonna skip ahead a little bit to where we see some of the time mechanics. Okay, I think here. Okay, yeah, so you'll be able to see here that you can control time. So that adds this other layer to the mechanics and the platforming mechanics of the game, where some components stay in one time, and you can control the time of other components. And as the game develops, it kind of makes more and more complex versions of this setup. So it's an interesting game to check out. Another kind of similar game that has kind of interesting aesthetics and
my name is
kind
Hamster, and don't tell anyone. In the blueberry
mechanics that are kind of like built into the game itself is Blueberry Garden. This is a really cool looking game that has some interesting mechanics. We'll just watch a little bit of this.
Okay, I don't understand the blueberry thing, or well, I guess it's not a blueberry. It's a red berry of some sort. Ooh, I have a rock. Can I throw? No. Oh, those are blueberries. Oh. Ah. Oh. I dropped my rock. Oh.
So you can see the aesthetics of the game have this kind of like cartoon illustration quality, and then the mechanics of the game are kind of emergent. Like it doesn't really tell you what you're supposed to be doing or how to do it. You can do some different simple interactions with the different objects in the scene, and then the way that they change kind of gives you hints about what you're supposed to do with those objects. So it's a pretty interesting game. Another indie game from 2009. Minecraft is on here. This is obviously a really popular game that we don't have to
let's go to a
explain.
place.
But it is an indie game in the sense that it was originally developed by a very small studio.
Let's go.
And it has a lot of the qualities that we expect from indie games, like this sort of blocky, simplified graphics, user-generated content,
day or night, rain or shine.
Focus on kind of like its own mechanics.
Sandbox you'll ever set foot in. Build a majestic castle. Invent a new machine, or take a ride on a roller coaster. Play with friends. Build your own little community. Protect yourself with the strongest armor that you can craft, and fight off the dangers of the night. No one can tell you what you can or cannot do, with no rules to follow. This adventure, it's up to you.
Now we're kind of like, so the 2000s, like, you know, these games are typically made by either programmers or on Game Maker, maybe Flash, things like that. Later than that, we have a lot more sort of different software and environments that we can make games in. And so we see a lot of new indie games that are really simplified, that may take on very specific topics. A good example of this is Dysphoria. This is a really short game that has sort of, the mechanics are sort of like frustrating or kind of satirical. And the subject of the game is about gender dysphoria and the sort of emotional experience of that, but it's gamified using different game mechanics. So we can watch a little bit of this to get that example. And it was published on Newgrounds, which is an indie game site where people can publish games and play games online. So it's very easy to publish something and distribute it. You don't have to have, a game studio to do it. Let's skip ahead a little bit. And so that's one of the things with indie games is that we can, there's a game that represents just very specific experience of the developer. And it's a sort of a simplified game with simplified mechanics. It's more telling a story than, being a full game that takes, hours to play or something like that. But it's using the aesthetics and mechanics of a game system or a game environment to tell a story. So it's kind of cool. It has these different levels with different levels of, different types of game mechanics and different challenges. Another game from this era is Depression Quest by Zoe Quinn. This is more of a text based type game where most of the game itself is reading through text and hyperlinks and things like this. This is a very popular and sort of influential game in the indie game world because it takes on, this emotional topic, depression, that is not typically the subject of games that come out of major studios. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. So you can see the game mechanic is, mostly reading and then clicking through these different hyperlinks, and then it includes photos as well. So again, the indie game world just has more breadth and, more creative freedom in terms of the subjects and things that games are talking about. Another cool example of that is this game called Papers, Please, also from around the same time period, 2013. And this kind of gamifies the experience of, trying to immigrate into a country. And so you see kind of the bureaucratic process of, trying to get a visa, trying to fill out the paperwork, all of those things that go into immigrating. And again, it borrows game aesthetics, it has game mechanics built into it, but it's also telling a story. So sort of another example where we see, violence recontextualized, this experience gamified, this like more serious, more real life experience turned into a game experience. So then moving into the kind of mid 2010s, another big change in the game world is, iPhones, iPads, mobile devices. This is another place where indie games are, there's a lot of potential for different types of indie games that don't require you to have like a really fancy PC or to even really know, like this game, Okwani, that we're looking at here, it just has touch interface. There's no really even instructions. Like everything you can do, you do just by moving the character around and swiping with your finger. It's a collaboration between a game developer and an illustrator, so you can see the illustrations are really interesting and high quality. And the game mechanic is just really simple. There's a puzzle that you're kind of figuring out, but there's no text. You don't have to read any instructions. You're just swiping up and down. And so that kind of makes games in some ways more, accessible to people who may not be, have a console at home or may not be familiar with, playing lots of different video games. Another video game
hey guys, breakthrough game
or indie game developer who makes kind of interesting different physics and game mechanics.
That's all the information I have on it, so let's jump in.
This is a really simple game with very simple aesthetics, no real instructions, and you're moving the whole game world as you're moving around, so it has this kind of interesting perspective.
Click on it, okay. Whoa, okay.
And so you can see the person who's playing the game is kind of figuring out the game mechanics as they play. So another thing with indie games, we can have these small, short experiences that just focus on one specific mechanic. Another mobile game, Plug and Play. This is a cool one that's mostly an aesthetic experience. There's not a lot of challenge to it, but it has these nice illustrations. And it's another collaboration between an animator and a game designer. And they've made a few games since this one that kind of have a similar look and feel. Stardew Valley is a game that I assume many of you guys have played or heard of. Another indie game that was made over the course of a very long time by a single developer. And one of the things I think is really interesting about this developer, he talks about how at the beginning of the game process, the type of art he was making looked much different than what it looked like by the end. So he had to kind of redo a lot of the original art that he created because he spent so much time on it. He just got much, much better at designing the art by the end. So he had to spend more time going back and redoing the original art that wasn't the same quality. And so he built this really nice resource management farming game that has a lot of narrative built into it, a lot of cool game mechanics, and just a lot of things that you can do, things that you can explore, different landscapes and things like that. This is a really, really popular game. I can't remember exactly, but I think it sold like 1 million copies or something like that. So it was like a really long process by one individual developer that turned into a big success. All right, so a few indie game sites to look at. itch.io is the one that we'll use later in the semester to actually publish our games. It's a good site. I have an account on here where I publish stuff sometimes, especially if I'm doing like game jams. I think that's what is cool about it is there's a lot of game jams. I definitely recommend you guys start, checking out game jams. There's like a calendar. These are specific to Itch, but there's other places that do game jams. But I find a lot of them on here. It's kind of fun because you'll basically do a game over the course of like a weekend or a week or something like that. Sometimes they have different themes. And so it's a lot of fun. It's a good way to kind of motivate yourself to try to get something done quickly. Usually the way it works is you can join a jam. There'll probably be a Discord for the jam and you can meet other people, say like, oh, I want to work on art or I want to work on programming or whatever. And you can team up with people and create something together. So I try to do a couple a year. Sometimes I do more, sometimes I do less. But it's a lot of fun and it's a good way to kind of make something quickly. If you have an idea that you just want to see if it works or not, it's kind of low stakes. Some jams have like awards and stuff like that, but most of them are, you just kind of make a game and people play each other's games, give each other feedback, and that's it. So you can see there's a ton of them happening. I definitely recommend trying a jam at some point. Maybe if you don't have time during the semester, during the summer or spring break or something like that, would be a good time to do it. IndieGames.com is more of a review site. So this is a good way to just know about games that are coming out that you probably wouldn't see necessarily in other places. So they just review all sorts of different indie games. It's a cool site to just kind of keep track of that world. Indiecade is a big festival, and it's kind of the big main festival for indie games. You can see submissions are now open. This is a cool place to really just like look at what people are making. So like looking back through like the awards from previous years, you'll see a lot of really interesting sort of cutting edge games if you look back through the archives of Indiecade. And then Game Jolt is another site. Let's see. Okay. Didn't used to have to sign in to see stuff. But it's another place where they publish indie games. You can see, lots of different games on here. And you can play them in the browser or download them for Windows or Mac and stuff like that. So similar to Itch, just a publishing platform for games. All right, I'm gonna stop recording and